Ignored black teen at a funeral reveals a truth that stuns the crowd. The church was heavy with sorrow, the air thick with the weight of unspoken emotions. At the back of the room, almost hidden in the shadows, Samuel stood alone, clutching a crumpled piece of paper in his trembling hands. His suit was too big, his shoes scuffed, his presence understated yet impossible to ignore. Every glance that darted his way seemed to linger a moment too long, eyes narrowing in silent judgment, questioning his right to be there. Samuel felt their stares prickling against his skin, as if the mere sight of him disrupted the carefully constructed order of the room. No one approached him. No one asked his name. He knew they wouldn't. He had felt this distance before, the invisible wall that separated him from people who saw only his skin, never his story. He had spent years running into one he wasn't sure he'd ever climb. His heart thudded against his ribs, relentless and unforgiving. The words on the paper in his hand blurred as his grip tightened, his fingers damp with nerves. He glanced up at the rows of mourners, their faces solemn and composed, their grief contained within the boundaries of tradition and decorum. He wasn't sure he fit anywhere. But today, something was different. Today, he had a truth to tell, even if no one was ready to hear it. They didn't need to. Samuel knew what they thought. He's nobody. He doesn't belong. He could feel it in the way their eyes flicked over him, sizing him up in an instant. His dark skin, his ill-fitting suit, the way he stood awkwardly apart from the rest of the mourners, it all marked him as an outsider. He'd felt this way before, countless times, in classrooms, on sidewalks, in stores where the clerks followed him too closely. But today, here, at the funeral of the man who had saved his life, the feeling cut deeper. At the front of the room, the casket rested beneath a cascade of white flowers. The polished wood gleamed under the soft light, a fitting tribute to Thomas Whitaker, a man beloved by the community. Samuel's eyes lingered on the casket, his chest tightening as a wave of emotions threatened to break through. Gratitude, sadness, and fear. Fear that he wouldn't have the courage to say what he needed to say. He glanced at the rows of mourners seated before him. They were well-dressed, composed, their grief elegant and dignified. Men in tailored suits, women with pearls around their necks, children sitting quietly with hands folded in their laps. These were Thomas's people, the ones who had known him as a neighbor, a friend, a mentor. They spoke of him in glowing terms, each story painting a picture of a man who had dedicated his life to helping others. But none of them knew the story Samuel carried. None of them knew the truth about the man in that casket, the truth that had kept Samuel awake at night, rehearsing the words he wanted to say. The pastor's voice broke through his thoughts, warm and steady as it filled the room. Thomas Whitaker was a man who touched many lives, the pastor said. He gave selflessly, loved deeply, and left a legacy that will live on in all of us. If anyone else would like to share a memory of Thomas, the floor is open. Silence fell over the room, broken only by the soft sniffles of mourners. For a moment, no one moved. Samuel's chest tightened as he watched a man in the second row rise from his seat. This was it. The moment was slipping away. He didn't know where the courage came from, but before he could second-guess himself, Samuel took a step forward. All at once, the room seemed to notice him. Heads turned, whispers rippled through the crowd, and Samuel could feel the weight of their stares. His pulse thundered in his ears, but he kept walking, his shoes echoing loudly against the polished floor. He stopped in front of the pulpit, his hands trembling as he unfolded the crumpled paper in his grip. For a moment, he couldn't speak. His throat felt dry, his voice caught somewhere between fear and determination. The crowd waited, their eyes filled with curiosity and skepticism. Finally, Samuel raised his head. His voice was soft, barely audible at first. "My name is Samuel," he began, his words shaky. "And I knew Mr. Whitaker, but not in the way most of you did." The whispers stopped. The room grew impossibly still, the tension almost suffocating. Samuel looked down at his paper, his hands trembling as he forced himself to continue. "To you, he was a friend, a neighbor, a mentor. To me, he was the man who saved my life." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Samuel took a deep breath, his voice growing stronger as he looked out at the sea of faces. "I know I don't look like I belong here, and maybe you're wondering why I even came. But Mr. Whitaker wasn't just a good man. He was the kind of man who saw people for who they really were, not for what they looked like or where they came from." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "And he saw something in me, even when I didn't see it in myself." The crowd leaned in, their curiosity now mingled with disbelief. Samuel felt the weight of their attention, but for the first time, he didn't feel afraid. He felt something else, a quiet strength, the kind Thomas had always believed he had. "I need to tell you the truth about him," Samuel said, his voice unwavering, "because it's a truth that you all deserve to hear." Samuel's voice echoed in his own mind as he paused, gripping the edges of the pulpit. The weight of his next words bore down on him, but he pressed forward, his gaze flickering to the faces in the crowd. "I wasn't always someone people would listen to," he said, his voice trembling but steady. "In fact, for a long time, I was someone people wanted to forget." The room was still, save for the sound of a distant cough. Samuel closed his eyes for a moment, the memories flooding back as if they were happening all over again. He saw himself at 12, a kid running through the streets of a neighborhood most people wouldn't dare visit. Broken streetlights, graffiti-covered walls, the constant hum of danger. Samuel had learned to survive in a world that didn't care about kids like him. He skipped school, avoided cops, and did whatever it took to get by. His mother worked 2 jobs, rarely home, leaving Samuel to fend for himself. His father? He didn't even remember the man's face. The streets became his teacher, and they didn't teach kindness. They taught anger. Anger at the world for treating him like he didn't matter. Anger at the teachers who looked at him as a lost cause. Anger at the police who pulled him aside. Not for what he had done, but for what he looked like. The memories were vivid. The officer who shoved him against a wall, the neighbor who crossed the street when she saw him coming, the cashier who followed him through the store, assuming he would steal. The anger boiled in his chest, and he lashed out in the only way he knew how. By the time I was 14, I was on a path that only led one way, Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. I thought the world hated me, so I gave it every reason to. The crowd listened, some nodding as if they understood, others stiff with discomfort. Samuel's eyes scanned their faces, searching for understanding. But then, he said, his voice softening, I met him. The memory was burned into his mind, every detail as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. It was late, the kind of night when the world seemed to disappear into darkness. Samuel sat alone on a cold park bench, shivering in a hoodie that did little to keep out the chill. His stomach growled, but he ignored it. Hunger was just another part of life, like the cracks in his shoes or the weight of the stares he got every time he walked into a store. He was angry, but more than that, he was tired. Tired of feeling invisible, except when someone wanted to blame him for something. Tired of pretending he didn't care. Tired of being alone. "Rough night?" The voice startled him. Samuel looked up to see an elderly white man standing a few feet away. He was bundled in a heavy coat, his face weathered but kind. Samuel tensed instinctively. He had learned the hard way not to trust strangers. "What do you want?" Samuel snapped, his tone sharper than he intended. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled, his eyes warm and patient. "Just thought you might want some company." Samuel scoffed, turning away. "I'm fine." "I don't think you are," the man said simply. "But that's okay. I'll sit anyway." Before Samuel could protest, the man lowered himself onto the bench, the wood creaking under his weight. They sat in silence for a while, the cold air wrapping around them like a shroud. Samuel stole a glance at the man, wondering why he hadn't left. "You don't even know me," Samuel muttered eventually. "No, I don't," the man agreed. "But I'd like to. My name's Thomas." Samuel hesitated, then sighed. "Samuel." Thomas nodded, as if this small exchange were the most important thing in the world. "Nice to meet you, Samuel." That night they talked. Or rather, Thomas talked, asking questions that Samuel didn't want to answer, but somehow did. About his life, his dreams he hadn't thought about in years. For the first time, someone listened to him, not as a problem to be solved, but as a person with a story. When they parted ways, Thomas handed him a card with his number. "If you ever need someone to talk to, call me," he said. "You're not as alone as you think." Samuel didn't believe him at the time, but weeks later, when the weight of the world felt unbearable, he called, and Thomas answered. Over the months that followed, Thomas became a fixture in Samuel's life. They met regularly at the park or a small diner Thomas liked, sharing meals and conversations that slowly chipped away at Samuel's anger. "Why do you care so much?" Samuel asked one day, frustration lacing his voice. "You don't even know me." Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying Samuel with a gentle smile. "Because someone cared about me when I needed it," he said simply. "And because you deserve a chance, Samuel. Everyone does." Those words stuck with him, burrowing into a part of him that he had long ignored. For the first time, Samuel began to see himself as more than the angry kid from the block. He started showing up to school. He avoided the trouble he used to seek out. And every time he felt himself slipping, Thomas was there to remind him of who he could be. "Samuel," Thomas said during one of their last meetings, his voice firm but kind. "You're smart. You've got a good heart. But the world's not always going to see that. It's not fair, but it's the truth. You have to fight for it. Prove them wrong." Samuel didn't realize then how much those words would shape him. But now, standing in the church, he understood. Thomas had seen something in him when no one else did, not even himself. And he owed it to him to tell the world the truth. Samuel paused, the memory of Thomas's encouragement washing over him like a tide. He looked up from the pulpit, his gaze sweeping over the faces in the crowd. Many of them were still, frozen in shock or disbelief. But others were different, stern, guarded, eyes narrowed with suspicion. He could feel their judgment even now in this sacred space. He knew what they were thinking. What's this kid doing here? What's his angle? In the middle of the congregation, a pair of women leaned toward each other, whispering just loud enough for Samuel to catch their words. "Who is he?" one murmured, her voice sharp with curiosity. "No idea," the other replied. "I didn't know Thomas had, friends like him." Samuel's jaw tightened, the words cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. It wasn't new, this kind of dismissal. He'd lived with it for years, in classrooms where teachers wrote him off, on streets where strangers crossed to the other side, in stores where clerks shadowed him as if he'd pocket something at any moment. But today, it felt heavier, as if the weight of those years had doubled under the watchful eyes of this room. He gripped the edges of the pulpit, his knuckles white. He wanted to turn around, to walk out, to leave these people to their polished grief and whispered judgments. But then he thought of Thomas, of the way the old man had smiled at him that first night, as if he'd known all along that Samuel was capable of so much more. The memory steadied him. He took a breath, his voice breaking the tense silence. "Thomas didn't care about where I came from or what I looked like," he said, his words sharper now. "But I see it in some of your faces. You're wondering what I'm doing here, why someone like me is standing in front of you." The murmurs stopped. The crowd leaned in, their curiosity now edged with discomfort. "I don't blame you," Samuel continued, "because that's how the world works, right? You see someone like me, and you assume you know the story. The troublemaker, the dropout, the problem." His voice wavered, but he pushed forward, each word weighted with truth. "That's what the world told me I was. That's what I started to believe. Until Thomas showed me that there was more to me than the labels people put on my skin." The room was silent, the air thick with tension. Samuel's voice softened as he began to tell the story, the whole story. How Thomas had found him on that park bench, angry and lost, and had changed his life with a simple act of kindness. "He didn't just help me," Samuel said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "He saved me. He gave me hope when I didn't have any left." He paused, his throat tightening. "But that's not the shocking part." A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. Samuel took another breath, steadying himself for what came next. "Thomas didn't just help me because he was a good man. He helped me because he understood what it felt like to be judged, to be seen as less, to be overlooked." Samuel's voice grew stronger, the raw emotion spilling into every word. You see, Thomas knew what it was like to face hate, not because of the color of his skin, but because of what he believed. He told me once that he'd lost friends because he refused to stay silent when he saw racism, that he'd been shunned by his own family because he stood up for what was right. The crowd murmured, their disbelief clear. Samuel pressed on, his words cutting through their doubts. "Thomas never told you that, did he? He didn't want the credit. He just wanted to do what was right. And he didn't just talk about it, he lived it. That's why he helped me. Because he believed in a world where people could see each other for who they really are, not for the assumptions we make about them." Samuel's voice broke, his hands trembling as he clutched the edges of the pulpit. "And now he's gone, but I'm still here. And I'm telling you his story because it's not just his legacy, it's his challenge to all of us, to be better, to see better, to do better." Samuel stepped back from the pulpit, his words hanging in the air like a weight too heavy to lift. For a moment, the room was silent, the crowd too stunned to respond. Then, slowly, one person began to clap. Then another and another. Before Samuel realized what was happening, the entire room was on its feet, their applause a wave of emotion that crashed over him. He blinked back tears, his chest tight with a mix of relief and disbelief. They were listening. They understood. As the applause faded, people began approaching him. An older woman clasped his hands, her eyes wet with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for sharing." A man in a crisp suit nodded solemnly. "I had no idea. Thomas never talked about any of this. But I'm glad you did." Samuel felt overwhelmed, their words washing over him like a tide. He had come here expecting to be dismissed, to be judged, but instead, he had been heard. By the time the service ended, Samuel stood outside the church, the cool air brushing against his face. He looked up at the sky, his thoughts drifting to Thomas. "You believed in me when no one else did," he murmured. "And now, I believe in myself." He turned to leave, his steps lighter than they'd been in years. He didn't know what came next, but he knew one thing for sure. Thomas's legacy wasn't just about kindness. It was about courage to see beyond the surface, to fight against hate, and to create a world where people like Samuel didn't have to prove they mattered. And Samuel would carry that legacy forward, one step at a time. Samuel stood outside the church, the crisp evening air brushing against his face. The last rays of the sun stretched across the sky, casting the world in soft hues of orange and pink. Behind him, the heavy oak doors of the church creaked open and shut as mourners trickled out, their faces marked by something more than grief. They looked changed, thoughtful, reflective, and in some cases, profoundly moved. He had done it. He had told the truth. But standing there now, Samuel couldn't help but feel the enormity of what had just happened. For years, he had carried this story inside him, hidden under layers of fear, anger, and doubt. Today, he had finally let it out. The weight should have been lifted, but instead it lingered, heavier than before. Not because he regretted speaking, but because he realized how much more there was to do. The church doors opened again, and the pastor stepped out, his footsteps soft against the stone path. He walked over to Samuel, his expression warm and kind, the same look Thomas used to give. "You know," the pastor said, his voice steady, "I've seen a lot of funerals in my time, but what you said in there, that was something special. It wasn't just a eulogy. It was a challenge to all of us." Samuel nodded, swallowing hard as he tried to find the right words. I wanted them to see him the way I did. And to see me too." The pastor placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "You did that, and more. You reminded us of something we all needed to hear." As the pastor walked away, Samuel turned back to look at the crowd. Small groups of people lingered in the churchyard, their voices low but animated. He watched as an older white woman knelt to tie the shoe of a black child, her smile gentle and genuine. Nearby, two men, one black, one white, shook hands, their conversation punctuated by nods of understanding. A young girl with braids embraced an elderly man, her face bright with emotion. These were small gestures, maybe even fleeting ones, but to Samuel, they felt like something bigger. They felt like the start of something. For years, Samuel had felt invisible, judged, dismissed. But here, now, he felt something different. He felt seen. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, the cool metal pressing against his palm. For a moment, he hesitated. What could he possibly say that would capture everything he was feeling? Then he thought of Thomas, the man who had taught him that even the smallest action could ripple outward in ways you'd never expect. With a deep breath, Samuel opened the camera and hit record. His face appeared on the screen, the faint glow of the sunset behind him giving him an almost radiant presence. He looked directly into the lens, his voice steady and clear. "Today, I told a story I've been holding on to for years," he began. "It wasn't easy, and to be honest, I was terrified. But I needed to do it because the truth matters. And the truth is, we all have stories like mine. Stories about being overlooked, being judged, being made to feel like we don't matter." He paused, his gaze shifting slightly as he glanced at the crowd behind him. The camera captured them too. Groups of people who, moments ago, might never have spoken to one another, but now stood together, their differences momentarily forgotten. "I came here today to honor a man who changed my life," Samuel continued. "Thomas Whitaker didn't just see me for who I was. He saw me for who I could be. He didn't see a problem kid or just another statistic. He saw a person. And because of that, he helped me believe in myself when no one else did." His voice grew firmer, filled with a quiet power that seemed to come from deep within. But here's the thing. Thomas shouldn't have been the exception. It shouldn't take someone extraordinary to see the humanity in someone else. It should be something we all do, every day. But the reality is, racism is still here. It's in our schools, in our workplaces, in our neighborhoods. It's in the way people look at me when I walk into a store. It's in the way people cross the street when they see someone who looks like me. Samuel's voice cracked slightly, but he pressed on, the emotion only making his words stronger. "I'm not saying this to make anyone feel guilty. I'm saying it because we can't change what we don't acknowledge. And change has to start somewhere. It starts with seeing each other, really seeing each other. Not for the labels society puts on us, but for who we are inside." The camera lingered on his face, capturing every nuance of his expression, the vulnerability, the determination, the hope. Thomas taught me that even the smallest act of kindness can change a life. He didn't have to sit down with me that night in the park. He didn't have to care. But he did. And because of that, I'm standing here today, telling you my story. He leaned slightly closer to the camera, his voice softening, but losing none of its power. "If you've ever felt invisible, like you didn't matter, I want you to know that you do. And if you've ever felt like you couldn't make a difference, I want you to know that you can. We all can. But it starts with us." Samuel took a deep breath, the weight of his words settling into something lighter, something hopeful. "So, here's what I'm asking. Let's start something together. Let's build a community where we listen to each other, where we learn from each other, where we lift each other up. Share this video. Tell your story in the comments. And if you're ready to take that first step, hit subscribe. Because this isn't just about me or Thomas or even today. It's about all of us. And it's about what we can do when we choose kindness over judgment, love over hate. Kindness has no borders. Change starts with us.